Today, I'm excited to be joined by Preston So, Director of Research and Innovation at Acquia. Preston leads Acquia Labs and new open source and research initiatives. First, though, we'll start with a little bit of housekeeping. I'm Cassandra Theocharis, Acquia's Senior Marketing Specialist, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. As usual, today's webinar is being recorded and we'll send all attendees a link to the recording in the next couple of days. Preston will be taking questions for about 5 to 10 minutes at the end of his presentation, so please submit any questions you may have inside the Q&A tab, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. So I'll also have a few copies of Preston's new book to give away to a few people who have their question answered by Preston at the end of today's webinar. Now, if you don't know much about Acquia, I'll give you a quick introduction to who we are and what we do. Acquia is the open source digital experience company. We provide the world's most ambitious brands with technology that allows them to embrace innovation and create customer moments that really matter. At Acquia, we believe in the power of community, giving our customers the freedom to build tomorrow on their own terms. So Acquia's platform allows organizations to build, manage, and activate ambitious digital experiences at scale. Thousands of organizations around the globe rely on our platform to power customer experiences across any channel. Our platform is open and built to be API first, which makes it easy to meet your organization's specific needs and environment. So over 3,500 organizations rely on Acquia to create new revenue streams, lower costs, and engage audiences more deeply. Acquia's digital innovation platform empowers market-leading enterprise organizations like NBC, NASDAQ, Fox, and Warner Music Group to create integrated digital experiences faster. So on that note, I'd like to introduce today's speaker. Today I'm joined by Preston So, Director of Research and Innovation at Acquia. So with that introduction done, I'll hand the mic over to Preston to begin.
Alrighty, thank you so much, Cassandra. Really appreciate the introduction. And welcome to today's webinar. It's a real pleasure to be spending an hour today with all of you. This is Talk Over Text, Conversational Interface Design and Usability. First and foremost, I just want to mention that I do a lot of speaking about topics in a range of topics, including things like decoupled Drupal, and I've been working with Drupal since 2007. As Cassandra just mentioned, I do have my book coming out later this month or next month. It's currently in production, and it's called Decoupled Drupal in Practice. If you're interested in anything related to decoupled Drupal anywhere along the stack, as Cassandra mentioned, there will be a few copies to be given away at the end during the Q&A. So please be sure to have the questions at the ready, and we'll be sure to answer those in due course. Also, I want to mention very briefly that I do also head up our Acquia Labs team, which is the innovation department at Acquia. We build projects that involve emerging technologies for a variety of our most important and large clients. That includes things like augmented reality, virtual reality, conversational interfaces, which is the topic of today's webinar, as well as things that are very much at the forefront of how we push the envelope in technology today. If you're interested in talking more about Acquia Labs, please feel free to contact either Cassandra or myself, and we'll be sure to put you in touch with our team. With that, let's go ahead and get started with a few of the topics that we'll talk about today. First and foremost, I want to talk about what is in a conversation. How do we define a conversation? And what exactly do we mean by conversational design? Next, because we are talking about Drupal, and because we are talking about Acquia, and because we are talking about content management, I do want to also delve into this idea of how we consider the difference between content in its traditional environment, namely the web, and how we can conceive of content when it comes to its conversational state. Then we'll jump into a couple of different components of how any conversational interface should work when it comes to a favorable experience for users, and when it comes to how your brand and your organization can provide the most compelling conversational experience for your users. And that includes aspects like information architecture, it includes things like design, it includes things like content strategy, and also user experience. Finally, I do know that all of you are interested also in hearing about examples and case studies of where things have been interesting and lessons that we've learned in the process. And so I'll be talking a little bit about one very interesting case study that we have here in the United States called Ask Georgia Gov, the first Alexa skill for citizens of the state of Georgia here in the US. Then finally, I'll also talk about how one of the most important aspects of conversational design is the fact that it is just one part of an overarching omni-channel content strategy. And that's a content strategy approach that Acquia can be very well positioned to help you with right now in this very moment. So first, let's talk about a little bit about what exactly is a conversation and how do we think of and consider what a conversation is in the context of conversational design. Well, when you think about the ways in which we have evolved in terms of our interfaces more recently, a lot of the ways in which we consume content and the ways in which we have experiences delivered to us are evolving very rapidly by the minute. And when you think about the fact that now it's no longer a website that defines the way that many customers learn about our brands and organizations, that is a very striking trait of the evolution of the most recent 5 years. For example, a smartwatch is a very compelling example of the fact that there's very limited real estate on the screen. You have to make sure that you limit what kind of content appears on the screen. And so if you're talking about a push notification, that's one thing. But if you're talking about, let's say, information that you need to get about a particular store's directions to their location, brick and mortar, that can be a much more complicated process. Same kind of idea is involved in things like digital signage. When you think about a large sign with a large screen, yes, you have much more real estate, but that information has to be both short, brief, and readable. And I'll talk a little bit more about exactly what we mean by brevity in the context of conversational design as well. Augmented reality is also part of this idea of decontextualizing content, removing content from its immediate source, removing content from the environment that it's in, and placing it in a context where of the overarching sense of the content, the overarching knowledge of the brand, the overarching awareness of the organization's identity that owns that content is something that is a lot less apparent from the beginning. And this is true of all of these experiences that I've mentioned so far. And of course, finally, we have to talk about conversational experiences. And there is one book that I highly recommend, and this is in addition to my own, by the way. It's called Conversational Design by Erica Hall. It's published by A Book Apart, one of the more common publishers for web designers. And it's a book that really delves into some of these ideas about how conversational design principles should be applied to any voice interface or chatbot that you may build. And this is something that Erica Hall says in her book that I find to be possibly the only takeaway that I would like for all of you to take from this webinar, which is that conversation is not actually a new interface, unlike smartwatches, unlike augmented reality, unlike some of these other interfaces that are coming out onto the arena in the last couple of years. In fact, conversation is really the oldest interface. When you think about the fact that conversation is the way in which we have been able to talk to each other, it's the way that I'm able to speak to all of you right now and have for many thousands of years. And in that sense, we should be able to apply a lot of those human principles that are behind human conversation and apply them to the ways in which machines provide conversational interfaces. Of course, that's a lot easier. That sounds a lot easier than it actually is. But if you think about the fact that in recent years, we've seen an emergence of zero interfaces. These are zero user interfaces, meaning that they have no physical or visual component. When you think about the fact that the most non-zero of these interfaces is a keyboard and mouse, you can see the very strong difference between how people interact with a smartphone to call a pizza joint, to get a pizza delivered to their house, versus how they might actually invoke that conversation through a voice interface. There is no visual or physical component when it comes to a conversational interface like a voice assistant, and when you're ordering a pizza through that same process. And so when we think about a zero user interface, which today is something that is a relatively new idea, but is something that has been on many user experience designers' minds for a very long time, when you think about the fact that an ideal user interface, according to Erica Hall, is an interface that's not noticeable at all, that actually serves to really illustrate how exactly conversational interfaces should also look in this regard. Conversational interfaces should aim to unblock you, the user, as much as possible. We should really reduce that distance between you having to invoke the initial interlocution that triggers that interaction that you want to pursue, and the ultimate outcome that you need to get to, and provide as little friction as possible in the process. Let's talk a little bit about the different kinds of conversational interfaces. There's two types of interfaces that I like to divide and bifurcate conversational interfaces in general into. The first is monochannel, which are specific to certain hardware. And these are things like Amazon Echo, for example. You can't use Amazon Echo unless you have Amazon hardware. Or things like Google Home. You can't use any sort of Google Home functionality unless you have a Google Home device set up inside your house or apartment. Chatbots, however, are oftentimes omni-channel. And what I mean by that is that oftentimes a chatbot can be something that you can use in the same exact way across a variety of different devices, whether it's a website, that little corner chatbot that pops up and says, "How may I help you today?" about as helpful as Clippy can be on Microsoft Office. And also chatbots that might be more helpful because they're contextualized into existing immersive experiences, like your smartphone, or like a large screen, or like other experiences that will actually serve the same conversation through the exact same process that you're used to on various axes, but is actually providing a differently designed interface slightly just because of the way it's presenting it. An SMS bot, for example, a text bot, is very clearly going to look different from the way a chatbot on a website might look, or a chatbot on your mobile application might look. One of the good things about this distinction, however, is that it's actually being blurred today. There's a proliferation of frameworks happening right now. Many abstractions are being built to aim to actually reduce some of the differences between how these two different types of interfaces actually operate. And so if you look at things like Dialogflow, for instance, a Google acquired company, also Amazon Lex, Wit.ai, IBM Watson, these are all frameworks that allow you theoretically to build a single conversational interface that then filters out to all of these different devices and makes that same exact interface available on Amazon Echo, which is monochannel, or on a chatbot or text bot or what have you in an omnichannel fashion. So let's talk a little bit about some of the examples of conversational interfaces. We're all aware of these, and we all probably use these on a daily basis. If you're an iPhone user, you might use Apple Siri very often. If you have a very wired home, a smart home, you might have Amazon Echo even built into other devices. I know many speakers today are now smart and have the ability to communicate directly with the user. There's also others like Cortana, the assistant on your phone for Android devices, Google Now, which is the web-based Google interface, and of course, Google Home, which is a more recent entrant into the market. When we consider how we might map these interfaces along an axis that makes the most sense for us, architects and developers, and also those who are considering what options we might want to pursue when it comes to delivering these sorts of interfaces to our customers, there's a very clear spectrum of flexibility that occurs. One of the biggest issues with some of the more built-in voice interfaces like Apple Siri and Microsoft Cortana is the fact that they are very limited in terms of their API. They're very limited in terms of the functionality that you can customize, the authority that you have over the ability for the device to serve different kinds of things. By contrast, Amazon Echo, Google Home both offer very complex and very large developer APIs that allow for you to create any skill of your choice according to the stipulations that you have. And in that sense, there's a wide bevy of custom interactions that you can produce based on those assistants. Let's take an example here of a conversation, jumping into how we might actually think about a conversation from the perspective of a designer. One of the most interesting things about when you order a pizza is that there's a difference between what I call a transactional conversation and an informational conversation. A transactional information is one that's really common when it comes to how we interact with a store or how we interact with a restaurant on the phone. What we might want to do, for example, is to ask that we want to have a pizza of a certain size. We want to make sure to have a combo deal or a discount applied to that pizza. And also, there might be some kind of confirmation from the user, from the user interface saying that, well, we're going to confirm that order and make sure that we get that transaction processed. An informational conversation, on the other hand, is very different from a transactional conversation. For instance, you might have a state where rather than asking about whether or not you want to order a pizza, you may actually want to ask about their gluten-free or halal or kosher policy. And that's something that lies very much outside of the general transactions that are handled by pizza shops on a regular basis. And so, for example, when you're asking about things like whether a pizza shop is halal certified, That's something that doesn't involve a transaction at all. It's something that merely involves a search for information. So the distinction between these two types of conversations is really around their components. We might have an intent that is something that the user holds, but that intent is meant to be used for a transaction. It's meant to be something that will eventually fulfill a transaction or a need that the user has. When it comes to an informational conversation, however, it might be the case that the user on the other end of the interface has a question that they're interested in having answered. They want to have certain information delivered to them by the interface in question. Of course, this actually involves more of a content search, because whenever we ask a question of friends or our families, we expect them to go into their database in their minds and consider what information they might be able to provide us. It's very different from the kind of transactional conversation that we might have with somebody who's a server at a restaurant or the owner of a pizza shop. And these kinds of content searches are today, of course, very common when it comes to websites, but they're not so common in conversational interfaces. And I'll talk a little bit more about how that idea of content search and that idea of informational conversations work from a design perspective. Here's another example that really illustrates the difference between how a transactional conversation works and how an informational conversation works. And you can see that, oftentimes we think about these informational conversations as things that might even be transactional, but actually are really not. Opening hours, for example, that's not a transaction, that's really information. And it could be that there's a variety of different questions that users do want to have answered in the process. So I want to emphasize here that conversational content is really involving informational rather than transactional interfaces. We're not talking about ordering pizza through a conversational interface. We're talking about actually acquiring content and having content delivered to the user through these interfaces. Now, I do have a demo here, but in the interest of time, because I want to make sure to get to everyone's questions at the end of this webinar, I do want to actually skip this video in favor of having this sent to you afterwards. And we'll make sure to have this video sent to everybody after this webinar is completed in order for us to proceed in a timely fashion. And with that being said, I do want to move into this idea of the distinction between web content versus conversational content. And this is a very interesting distinction that I think is very relevant to all of us who are working in content strategy, who are also working with our editorial and marketing teams, and have to consider whether our website content is ready for prime time or not. There's a long history of spoken web content, a long tradition, a long legacy of spoken web content that exists on the internet today. Many times, actually, in the early 2000s, there were a lot of text-to-speech telephony services that allowed for users of assistive technologies to be able to actually have web pages dictated to them. And these do still exist today. If you call many hotlines, you'll get information read to you by an automated voice or an automated recording. And today, however, when you look at the fact that many people are using these devices in a spoken fashion, we now have the concept of screen readers. And one of the things that I recommend for any developer who works in accessibility or who is interested in how spoken content works or how conversational content works is to take on the persona of a user of one of these screen readers for once. There are many extensions available for your browser. Such as one of them that I use is called ChromeVox for Google Chrome. And I highly encourage all of you just once during your process of building a project to actually try out using your website in a screen reader or using some experience that you've built in a screen reader. How does that work? And how does that actually make you change your impressions of how that interface and how that content should actually look? Because what you'll notice is that screen readers are actually very different from how we, who might be using a browser visually, are using web pages, are using web content today. Now, one of the problems of spoken web content, as we all know, is that when you hear somebody drone on for a very long time, it can become very disengaging. It can be something that becomes something that really you become less attentive to. And so I call this a low verbosity tolerance. You can't really listen to an entire news article being read unless you're really focused on that task. But it can be as long as a 15-minute recording, and that can be a very long process for a lot of people. So web-based content tends to consist of screen-based or long-form prose. That means that it's generally narrative text. And we generally use a physical or visual interface by necessity to browse through web-based content because it involves a lot of text, it involves a lot of prose. But there's also many links and references. There's also a lot of different places that we can go down. One of the things that many people do is play the Wikipedia game. Can you get from one article on this end of the spectrum to the other side with the ability to actually access that article solely through links? The good thing, however, about web content is that there's a high verbosity tolerance. If you have a 13-page article that you want to read on your way to work, that's something that's perfectly feasible. You just can scroll through it if you don't find a part of the article that's as appealing. But with conversational content, there's a very wide gulf between these two ideas. In conversational content, we really are talking about short individual utterances. We're talking about things that are individual sentences that people will be able to process in a very short amount of time. We're talking about an aural and a verbal interface. We can't have many links. There is no ability to click links or click on references when it comes to a conversational interface. And there's also a very low verbosity tolerance, which means that we can't really hear that person drone on for too long. So here's an example of the distinction between web versus conversational content. We have a section on the left here, which describes a pizzeria in the Raleigh-Durham area in North Carolina. And this Raleigh pizzeria has a website that has all of its information there right then and there. But in a conversational interface, we actually want to divide up this information into different tidbits so that we don't overwhelm the user all at once. Because imagine having this entire paragraph and list of deals read to you in a screen reader, for example, or in an Amazon Echo. It's a very long process. And this might be also true in a chatbot. Having a long chat balloon that really doesn't necessarily have the briskness of a text message is something that can also be a little bit overwhelming from the end user perspective. And so in this slide, on the right side, you can see that there's a lot of examples of how we mean to give feedback to the user, how we mean to provide content in certain ways, but all throughout the process, we're giving the user just enough information to proceed, but not be overwhelmed by the amount of text that we're presenting them. So conversational content has to present information in a comprehensive but efficient way. There can't be an overwhelming amount of information that the user receives. Now, just to illustrate that point even further, let's jump into some of these components of conversational interfaces that are involving content and that really dive into how we might want to consider conversational interfaces from the perspective of aspects like information architecture. Information architecture, as we all know from site design, is a very important concept, and how we architect our websites and how we help users navigate through websites is a very important concept that has been written on for many decades now. But when we think about a general website architecture, a website information architecture, the most interesting thing about that is that we generally use things like sitemaps. And these are hub and spoke architectures. These are things that are gigantic expanding web of various things that we might want to access in the future. Or they might be a hierarchical nav bar, a navigational bar that actually allows us to access every single link and see every single aspect of the site within its given hierarchy. There are lists of links and they help us to actually get to the places that we want to go, but all of the information is presented to us at once. We see all of this information right up there at the top of the website. In a web-optimized information architecture, we can see everything structured. Everything is given to us right away. We see exactly what the website looks like from the standpoint of its hierarchical structure. But in a conversational information architecture, that structure actually has to be given to us directly. We have to have some kind of a simple illustration of what this information architecture looks like. And so here's an example of that. Where it comes to things like the main primary links in your website, for instance, or your content experience, you might want to only limit the options available to a couple or no more than 5 or so, because you have to describe each of those things to be able to give the user context about what that information is that they're going to be receiving once they actually say those things or invoke those links to those locations. And you might want to take some of these other underlying interfaces, things like informational interfaces, transactional interfaces that involve ordering systems and things like that, to a second level that's deeper and underneath, such that the user does not actually see that from the very beginning of their experience. So information architecture really requires guided flows. They require unidirectional flows that are very simple and that really guide the user in the process and don't require things like sitemaps or nav bars. Now, one way that just to stop here for a moment, one way that I really love to illustrate the idea of an information architecture that involves a unidirectional flow is an idea that many people may remember from high school ecology or from college ecology. In ecology classes in Colorado, where I'm from, we learned a lot about the concept of dichotomous keys in terms of tree identification. And tree identification is a process that can be very painstaking if you don't have a very simple guided process to take you through that process. And so just to illustrate for those of you who don't know what a dichotomous key is, this is a series of cards that allow for you, the user of that dichotomous key, to identify a tree based on a series of something like 20 questions where there's only 1 or 2 answers. An example question might be the very beginning one, which is this tree a needled tree, meaning is this tree a coniferous tree, or is this tree a leafy tree? Is it a deciduous tree? And from that point on, you move into deeper and deeper complexity to identify things like the nature of the bark, the tree, the texture of the bark, the texture of the leaves, the striation on the leaves. And in the process, because every single card in that dichotomous key only has 2 options, you have a much simpler process, a much easier way to get to your final destination of content and the final identification of that tree, rather than having to have a whole mass of information presented to you all at once. I find this metaphor very effective to illustrate exactly how an information architecture from this standpoint should work. Let's talk a little bit about design now. Paul Grice wrote several conversational maxims that are part of every conversation. He's a sociologist that looked at how does every conversation work and what is present in every single human conversation, regardless of who is having that conversation. And he identified 4 traits, in addition to another one identified later by Lakoff, that really illustrate how every human conversation should work. And Erica Hall argues in her book that these conversational maxims should be followed every time you design a conversational interface in itself as well. These are quantity, which means you want to provide just enough information, not too much. You don't want to overwhelm the user, as I just mentioned. Quality, you want to be honest with your information. You don't want to have information that's false. You don't want to have information that is not true. Relation, you want to be relevant. You want to give the user, you want to give the person that you're talking to information that's relevant to the conversation and not go on a digression that doesn't make any sense. And of course, manner. You don't want to go on for too long. You don't want to have the ability for the person on the other side of the conversation to very quickly lose interest because you're going very far in a direction that is not interesting. And also, you want to reduce ambiguity. You don't want to have the user become confused. And Lakoff actually adds a 5th one, which I believe is also a very important component of these conversational maxims. Her 5th maxim is this idea of politeness. Every conversation should have some modicum of pleasantness, some modicum of the ability for the user to feel like they're interacting with a positive interface that is here for them to be helped. Erica Hall also identifies 4 key moments in the context of these conversational maxims that are what every single conversational interface should follow. And that includes things like the introduction. You want to invite interest by the user. You want to tell the user what's going on and say, hey, welcome to this interface. Let me tell you about what's here. And that's also the process of orientation. You want to give the user the ability to go all the way back to the beginning, to restart, to reset, and also to exit out of any process. And those fundamental functions that every single user should be able to perform at any point in the process of the interface is orientation. Those are system options. However, there are points in the process where besides those fundamental options, we're going to give users some other custom options to go down. And these are sets of tasks or options, for instance. These could be things like pepperoni or pineapple. And user controls, for example. How do you go back a step, or how do you go back to the previous section? And finally, what I believe to be the most important of all of these 4 is guidance. You want to give the user feedback. If you order a pizza and the other person on the line doesn't tell you that your pizza is ordered, you have absolutely no idea of knowing that your pizza is on the way to your house. And that's also true of feedback. You want to be very clear about when there is a mistake or when there is some kind of confusion about what you've said. In conversational design, we're not talking about design on a visual canvas. We're not talking about designs through wireframes or through Photoshop. We're talking about design through language. We're talking about writing good language and also designing certain structural flows. Let me give you an example of this. And this is a point where many of my friends are very skeptical because, of course, it's tough to be a good writer and a good designer at the same time, but both skills are very necessary when it comes to conversational design. And when we design language, we have to think about all of these 4 key moments as well as those 5 conversational maxims. Here, for example, we see that the pizzeria conversational interface, whether it's a chatbot or whether it's a voice assistant, is giving us certain key information that adheres to these 4 key moments. First of all, we have the introduction. We encourage the user to trust this interface. We have the orientation. We give the user those core system options that they can access at any point. And then at some point in the process, as the user goes deeper and deeper into the interface, we also have certain options that we know the user will have to access in order to have a successful transaction in the end. And then finally, we also have feedback and guidance so the user knows that their actual action has been registered and their operation is proceeding as planned. Now, this is how it looks like when it comes to a flow. And flow design is just as important as well-written language when it comes to a conversational interface. You want to be able to show that at any point in the process, it's very clear where the user can go and how the user can access certain ideas. And so in this process, what you can see is that as the user pursues more and more of these options down the process, it goes deeper and they go deeper and deeper into the skill. And we see how these flows are very crucial to helping users have a little bit of a visual sense in their minds of where they're proceeding to go. Let's talk briefly also about content strategy and how we can make conversational content really friendly for those interfaces that we know that users want to be using today. After all, many users have switched over to voice. We now have evidence that as of last year, 40% of all searches are conducted on mobile by voice. And there's two aspects of this that I always like to talk about. The first is conversational legibility, which is that legibility from the standpoint of a reader is this book something that is very easy to read? Is this article something that I can read? Or is it full of mistakes? Or is it full of confusing garden path sentences? Or is it full of ungrammatical structures that don't make sense? When it comes to conversational legibility, we want that to be just as understandable to a listener. And we actually want to prestige the listener even more so than the reader. We have to make sure that the content is structured in a certain way so that it lends itself to conversational interfaces. That's what I talk about when it comes to things like information architecture. And we also want to make sure that we make it part of an omnichannel strategy because we might have other devices and other channels that will be using the same exact content. And that's very true of any content that you might have that you want to serve to digital signs, that you want to serve to interactive kiosks, that you want to serve to VR interfaces, and so on and so forth. Here's an example of how we can take certain information that is already present on websites and actually do very little work to make them something that is conversational. For example, the summary field in Drupal. You can take a long form paragraph or a long form page of web text and turn it into a single paragraph or a few sentences solely by using the summary field in the Drupal interface. With short form, you can also make sure that you don't express too much information all at once. And that's actually one of the reasons why things like menus and list items are often very good candidates for conversational content. There's also, of course, FAQs. FAQs are possibly one of the best ways to ease your way into conversational interfaces without too much friction and too much need to rewrite content, because there is the ability to go ahead and say, well, let's just transmit all of this information in the FAQs into a conversational interface, and it works right out the box from a content strategy perspective. The second approach that is really important, and the second consideration that I find to be very crucial when it comes to these interfaces, is conversational discoverability. For example, one of the most persistent problems in conversational interfaces is how do you go back to the beginning and how do you know where you are, because there is no visual reference for where you are in the course of the conversation. And as you can see in this flow, as the user continues down this conversational flow, the content that they're trying to get to at that very bottom right is becoming less and less discoverable. It's becoming something that is less and less able to be found. It's almost like an SEO problem. It's something that is very hard to find, and the user will oftentimes lose the track of getting to that point because they will have had so many times and so many obstacles to get to that content that they end up bouncing out of the conversational interface. Finally, let's talk a little bit about user experience. When it comes to user experience, we're not so interested in dialogue interfaces or buttons or how people are being tracked with their eye movements. We're actually more interested in dialogues with the UE. We're talking about how people are actually feeling and how they're experiencing the interlocutions that they're having with the conversational interface, whether it's a chatbot or whether it's a voice assistant. For example, conversational usability is actually a very unexplored and poorly understood area. It's relatively immature right now in usability because it's a very aural and not a visual or physical interface. It's not something that you can really consider from the same standpoint as we do website usability studies. And we can't use things like no eye tracking or no think aloud when it comes to voice interfaces, because voice interfaces can have interference from things like think aloud. And of course, there is no eye tracking when it comes to most chatbots and when it comes to voice interfaces. So I recommend that everyone explore the retrospective probing approach. And this is an approach that has been recommended by the White House, by the federal usability group and in the United States, as well as usability groups around the world. And retrospective probing is a process that allows for us to evaluate and assess how conversational interfaces are working from the voice interface perspective. We want to look at not exactly how the user is speaking or how their impressions vocally during the process. we assess all of those after the interface has already completed its process for the user. The reason why is because we don't want to have the user say something to the evaluator, to the person who's testing the user, and have that become an introduction of poor data or misplaced data or bad data into the usability study. We want to keep those two worlds very separate. However, there is a very strong disadvantage, of course, with retrospective probing, which is the fact that we have horrible memories, all of us, and being able to remember what happened 5 minutes ago, even though it's mere 5 minutes ago, can be something that is very difficult for even the most savvy of usability research subjects. As we know, in voice assistants, we don't have the ability to think aloud and do concurrent probing, which is the process by which we ask questions about users' impressions during the process that they're using, during which they're using this interface. And these only really work in a chatbot context. But when it comes to being able to compare across all of these different interfaces in an agnostic fashion, there is really no approach that works across the board other than retrospective probing. So let's talk a little bit about one case study that I have worked on in the context of Acquia Labs. And this is a really interesting case study that illustrates all of these aspects that I've been talking about over the last 40 minutes. Ask Georgia Gov, which you can go to your Amazon device and download right away today, is a new Alexa skill which gives citizens of the state of Georgia answers to questions about important questions that they need to engage civically as a citizen. And these can be things like, how do I renew my driver's license? Or how do I register to vote? How do I enroll my child in some kind of a program or children's health insurance in the state of Georgia? And you can also ask things about Georgia's history. What is Georgia's state animal, for example? What is Georgia's state motto? And who is Georgia's governor? That's Nathan Deal, by the way, currently. And that's the only reason I know that is because of this project that we worked on in Acquia Labs. Once again, in favor of saving time for questions at the end, rather than play the demo here, I'm going to have us actually forward you with the slides, the full demo, so you can see it for yourself. And this is also available on many places on the Acquia website. Now, the Ask Georgia Gov skill was a very interesting interface because it involved this idea of helping users get to information faster. All of us have experienced this problem of governments where we have to either call a hotline and wait on hold, or we have to wait in long lines in an agency office. And Georgia, in this case, decided that they wanted to actually provide a shortcut for users to have questions answered without necessarily having to talk to a human. We also wanted to make sure that Georgia maintained its high focus on accessibility. The state of Georgia has been extraordinarily progressive and pioneering when it comes to accessibility. In the early 2000s, actually, Georgia was one of the first states in the entirety of the United States that offered a text-to-speech telephony service that read out web pages to you aloud through a hotline. And so because of this focus of theirs, they really wanted to have some kind of an approach that allowed for users of these technologies to also have a different means of engaging with this content and engaging with their governments. And of course, finally, we also wanted to make sure to have an open source foundation using Drupal, using open technologies. And as a matter of fact, if all of you would like to actually put this on your Drupal 8 or Drupal 7 website, we maintain both versions of the Alexa module on Drupal. And you can actually download and install that module on your website today, right now, at drupal.org/project/Alexa, and actually put that on your website and begin to customize and code some of the ways in which you can build your own conversational interfaces through a Drupal site. In terms of the strategy of the overarching interface, we wanted to make sure to build toward a single source of truth. And this is one area where Georgia really came to us and said, we need to make sure that we have one single interface for our editors. We don't have multiple editorial teams. We don't have the ability to have multiple versions of content. We need to have one single version of content that will be shared across every single channel, regardless of what that channel may be in the future. So here's exactly what the georgia.gov website looks like. For those of you who haven't seen the website, which is probably all of you, this is actually an interesting website that engages in a structural pattern of topical pages. Every single popular topic here, there are 52 of them, has a page of its own that consists of an interesting structure. First of all, we have the topic title, which is the actual phrase that describes what it is that we want to talk about. Then we have a what you should know section that involves the most important description of that particular information, as well as important information that every single person on this page should know. From then on, we have a series of FAQs with questions and answers that are answers to questions that any citizen of the state of Georgia might have. Now, as you can see, one of the things that we've done is actually to adhere to all of these 4 key moments that Erica Hall has identified. When you actually go to the video later on and you see this, I highly encourage you to follow along with the slides and take a look at how these 4 key moments are playing across each other. Here we're having them color-coded to illustrate how exactly GeorgiaGov, the Ask GeorgiaGov skill, is able to welcome the user, to introduce this interface to the user, to orient the user, to help the user act through a series of tasks, and also to guide the user with compelling feedback. Here you can see that we have an instance where the user was not understood by the interface. And so we have a feedback mechanism that allows for the interface to respond and request more information. Then, once the user has had a successful content search completed, and this is, by the way, a site search across all of the state of Georgia's website. It's a mere search that is forwarding results back to Alexa. In that sense, we can actually have the skill respond in an intelligent fashion as well. And as you can see, as we go down, every single step of the process has some kind of component that is adhering to these 4 key moments in the process. And at the very end, we have a state of the place where, this interface only answers certain questions. And there is a very good chance that many of these citizens actually have more questions about how they can get their driver's license. And they might have more questions that are not actually reflected or represented on the Georgia website. And as a result, we offer them the ability to request a phone number so they can call the agency hotline only after they've asked the question to the Alexa skill first. And here's what the flow looks like. At every step in the process, we offer the user the option to go all the way back to the orientation stage, all the way back to that initial point where we gave them those fundamental options. And as you can see, this flow does work very well because we actually have the ability for the user to never lose themselves in the process. There's a very clear delineation that as you go deeper, it makes sense where it is you're going. And the user has this logical sense of every single conversation they open with this Ask GeorgiaGov interface. So there's 2 very important ideas that we established here with the Georgia team. Number 1 is that we wanted to make sure that the Georgia editorial staff would not be burdened by conversational content. And in doing so, we actually made sure that when you edit a piece of content on the Georgia website as one of these editors, you are actually editing the exact same piece of content. It doesn't actually matter what it is that you're editing. It's the same piece of content shared across both the website and the conversational interface. And you'll notice actually that if you go to the Georgia.gov website today, and you look at the text on that website right now, and you go to the Ask GeorgiaGov skill, the readouts of those question and answers are exactly the same as what's on the website. We also performed a content audit, and this is very important if you want to share content across both a conversational and a web-based content approach. If you want to perform this audit, I highly recommend that you look at these results of the audit that we produced in terms of how exactly they can help you to provide an omnichannel focus for your conversational content as well. If you are looking at centralizing all of your content and making sure that content is in one place and not split into 2 different buckets, a content audit is absolutely essential. And this is something that never has been done before as far as we know. As you can see, one of the things that we did is to recontextualize content that has been decontextualized through the process of being placed on the website. As we all know, if we see a certain phrase on the website, like unemployment benefits, we know that the rest of the page will be about unemployment benefits. But that's not so clear on a conversational interface. For example, if I hear an Amazon Alexa saying, how long can I receive benefits? On the website, I know that that's about unemployment benefits. But if I'm on the Alexa skill, I have no idea what benefits that's referring to. It could be any kind of benefits that are under the sun. And so we want to make sure to recontextualize content that's been decontextualized in that process. And actually, this actually served to actually improve the SEO of the content as well. Next is links. Links and calls to action are impossible in a voice interface to actually pursue in any kind of rigid way. You can't tell somebody to read more about this by clicking here. You can't tell somebody to learn more. You can't tell somebody to read more because there is no way to do that on a conversational interface. And so in this process, we actually contextualize all of the links so that they are parts of text and are indiscernible from the rest of the text. And that means that all links become actually part of the text and fully immersed in the existing text that was there. And in this process, we actually served to help reduce the amount of text that was on the page and reduce things like this situation where we would have a read more about this link that led to a completely different web page. But instead, we can put a brief summary of that content directly in and link just the name of that program to that additional page for those web visitors. In this process, we also did retrospective probing, and we did 2 usability studies, 2 rounds. And what we did is we asked users to do 3 things. We wanted them to, first of all, access the topic about, for example, a business license. We wanted them to ask a question that was related to that, but that would not be accessible from that first stage. And then we wanted to make sure that they asked for a phone number so that we went through the entire process with every single user study. Now, what are the results? Well, 8 months later, we had a roughly 80% success rate on all interactions. And by the way, for Amazon Alexa skills, that is a very high number. If you have ever used an Alexa skill on your Amazon Alexa, you'll know that the success range is quite low because the Alexa will oftentimes have trouble understanding or will expect a certain different response. And so that's actually a very high number. And one of the things that we found very interesting about this process is that we logged also for the benefit of Georgia so they could collate this data and see exactly who was able to query certain data on the web and who was able to query certain content on the voice interface. And interestingly enough, there was a very big difference between the most popular keywords on web versus on your Amazon Echo. The most popular keyword on Amazon Echo tends to be about vehicle registration, whereas on web-based content, they tend to be more about registering to vote or about driver's licenses in general. Now let's talk a little bit very briefly about conversational content in the omnichannel context. But before I do, I want to jump right back one slide to this final slide and tell you a little bit of an anecdote about this Georgia case. One of the most interesting stories that we have is that a few months into the launch, after the launch had already happened, we saw a very strange entry that was coming in, a very strange query that was coming in and logged, and it was hitting a 404. It wasn't able to actually return a proper search result. And we looked at the log and we saw that there was somebody who kept on searching for driver's lawsons. Lawsons spelled Lawsons. And we came to realize that this is actually part of a Southern Georgian drawl that the user had and was a very strong accent that Amazon Alexa wasn't able to pick up on. And so this is a way sometimes, and this anecdote really does illustrate, for example, how we can be very hamstrung by the natural language algorithms and be beholden to those algorithms that need to improve separately and independently from our interfaces that we build. Now for a quick epilogue, I want to talk about a couple of takeaways. Conversational interfaces can't be hub and spoke. There is no way to have a hub and spoke or hierarchical structure illustrated for the user. Also, design must involve this focus on both the language itself and also the flows. We want to provide wayfinding not through links and not through instructions, but through flows. And we also want to provide the ability for this richness to be illustrated through language. Also, content strategy. We want to avoid over-contextualizing content. Content is decontextualized when we have a conversational experience. And also, finally, consider using retrospective probing if you're administering a user study for a voice interface. And also consider doing that also for chatbots because it might give you interesting results, especially if you want to compare those two different interfaces together. But in the sense of user experience, we can't actually adhere to some of the principles that we find on the web in this context. Just to finish up here, conversational interfaces are the most human of interfaces. They are very much important to the way that we have interacted for centuries and millennia, which means that we have to make sure that our conversational content is also part of a larger content strategy that makes sense for all brands and for all organizations and for all channels. Also, conversational interfaces must be human-centered in language and flows, which means that we must consider the human aspect of conversation first and foremost, because we don't have the ability to learn how to use these artificial interfaces that have been created since the Industrial Revolution, like the keyboard and mouse, like the screen. I want to end here once more with a brief mention of my book. If you would like to read more about decoupled Drupal, which is the other, one of the other areas that I speak very often about, please do consider pre-ordering my book. It's available right now on Amazon and on Apress. You can go to tiny.cc/decoupled-in-practice to actually go and pre-order that right now on Amazon.com. And we'll be having a giveaway right now with the Q&A here, thanks to Cassandra. With that, thank you very much, and I'll hand the mic right back over to Cassandra. Thank you.
Thanks, Preston. Great presentation, and we've had a couple of questions come in. Any questions we don't have time to get around to, we'll be answering on email also, just to keep everyone on time today. We'll be finishing at 12 on the dot. Okay, so let's start here. We have a three-part question from Sabarish. He asks, how would I find kinds of conversation that my customer would ask for, how will I categorize those questions? And do I have any already made frameworks that would help me frame these conversations and categorize them?
It's a very good question. Because it's a very new area, I don't know of any product or any project that's in the open source world, for example, that allows for you to categorize questions and answers dynamically. But what I can tell you is that the structured content that is present in Drupal already offers a great deal of the structure that you need to get started with your conversational interface. And what's really nice about things like Amazon Alexa and building interfaces using developer APIs that have this customization ability, you can actually use that to adhere to the structural content that Drupal provides. So if you have, for example, categories of FAQs, you can use that and actually articulate that within your conversational interface in such a way that you can have those categories accessed through that conversational interface as if it was on Drupal as well.
We have a question from Ravi here saying, what the design principles for conversational content taxonomy? Does it fit in any existing domain content model?
That's a very good question. I'm going to try my best to interpret the meaning of that question. I think that when it comes to taxonomy, I believe you're referring to Drupal taxonomy. Taxonomy can be a very helpful and also a very unhelpful tool when it comes to building conversational interfaces. We do want to make sure to access content through things like search terms, but oftentimes we might want to also offer users the ability to search by tags. And this is why adhering to a Drupal-based approach to conversational interface building can be a very helpful thing, because by using and leveraging the existing paradigms that exist with site search, and by using an existing tool like taxonomy in Drupal, you can actually acquire content in a much more refined way that actually allows for you to have both at their disposal, both the tags that you might want to have them access, and maybe you want to offer them as part of a separate list within that conversational response, or it might be something that you provide later on in the process.
We have another question from Emma. Often I find that platforms on the market lack context meaning. For a very basic example, if I say, Kelly is online, where is she? The device doesn't know who she is. Do you have any examples of platforms that do this well, understanding context?
That's a great question, Emma. I think that from the Drupal perspective, it's, from the Amazon Alexa perspective, that's a very challenging proposition, because generally speaking, you don't want to save private data to these kinds of interfaces. However, when it comes to acquiring user data, for example, if you have a chatbot that has authenticated user access to permissions on Drupal and is able to actually give certain information, you can use user roles and permissions to provide a differentiated way of actually providing that response to that interlocution or that particular question. For example, Kelly could be a user that is identified solely because the person who is on the other end of the interface actually has access to the user database that contains the user Kelly. If not, then the interface would return something like, well, you don't have access to this, or we can't find the user by that name. So by using things like existing tools in Drupal, such as permissions and roles, you can actually have this occur. And one other thing I want to mention is that on the Acquia Lift roadmap for our personalization product, we do have the ability eventually for you to be able to access things like the decision API and all of those kind of functionalities that allow you to segment based on audiences and contextualize the way that users access this conversational content on conversational interfaces and not just on websites. Please look more on that coming in the next couple of quarters or the next year from the Acquia Lift team.
Cool. And we might just do one more question. We have here from Kate. What should a conversational content audit look like?
It's a great question. I'm happy to share with you a couple of pages from our conversational content audit. Unfortunately, I cannot go and give you the entire 64-page document, but it was a great deal of work. Now, the conversational content audit should generally consist of four things. The first is you want to look at every single piece of text that exists, and you want to read and reread every single piece of content and evaluate whether or not this is something that makes sense in the conversational environment. And it's very easy to do that on a website when you read it and you see a link that refers to something that is impossible to access on a conversational interface. You also want to have a record of every single link that exists on a web page. By doing so, then you actually have a sense of where all of the references are pointing, and you can also identify how you might want to point to those references in your conversational interface down the road, if you so desire. But if not, then you have a very strong record of every single point at which you can identify those links, and also make sure that you recontextualize those links so that they don't sound very jarring to the user of a conversational interface. The final thing that you can do also is to evaluate exactly how every query is able to access the content. And so this is something that we did for this project, is that we looked at every single question on the FAQs and we said, is this question something that a user could feasibly say given just the topic title? If, for example, if it's driver's licenses, is it feasible for somebody to ask a question like, I'm moving to Georgia, I need a driver's license, can I get it renewed? Or should the question be something like, if I'm moving to Georgia, can I get my license renewed, and how? And how should those kind of questions be rewritten to decontextualize the fact that it's not present on a web page that already has that context? Now, the final thing you want to do with the conversational content audit is to go through and make recommendations to the editorial team. And the editorial team will go ahead and accept or decline those recommendations. But oftentimes you'll want to have a priority system for those recommendations. For example, things like searches that lead to multiple results that are completely unrelated. That's a priority 1 issue. If it's something where it's a link that maybe points to something else, but isn't information that's extremely necessary for that interlocution within the conversational interface context, then maybe that's a priority 4, or maybe that's a priority 5. And then you also want to make sure to categorize all of those findings that you have in a document that shows all of those things. And if you'd like, I can work with Cassandra afterwards. Very happy to provide a few pages from the conversational content audit that we performed for the Ask Georgia Gov skill.
All right, so it looks like we're out of time for further questions, but I'd like to thank everyone for attending today and for your wonderful questions. If we didn't have any time to answer them today, Preston will answer them on email shortly. And thank you again, Preston, for such a great presentation. And just remember to keep an eye out for the recording and slides this week on email as well. And thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day.